They handed her a bank book with a single dollar in it, and the whole family laughed like it was the best joke they'd heard in years. What none of them knew was that the $1 wasn't the inheritance. It was the key, and the door it opened would bury every last one of them. For 51 years, Eleanor Voss did the quiet work that no one claps for. She raised the children her husband was too busy to see grow up. She sat through the long nights when his business nearly collapsed and said nothing about her own fears so his wouldn't grow. And when the cancer came for Walter, slow, cruel, 13 months of it, she was the one who learned to change the dressings, to measure the morphine, to sleep sitting upright in a hospital chair so her hand never left his. She was 81 years old, and on the morning they read his will, she owned almost nothing but the dignity of having stayed. You know this feeling, even if your version is smaller. You're the one who shows up. You're the one who remembers the birthdays, who drives the long distance, who answers the phone at 2 in the morning. And somewhere along the way, you started to wonder whether anyone actually sees it, or whether the ones who do the least somehow always end up holding the most. Whether loyalty is a virtue or just a slow way of being taken for granted. Hold on to that question, because Eleanor asked it too, sitting in a room full of people who had already decided she deserved nothing. And the answer, the real answer, was locked inside a plain vinyl bank book, waiting in a place no one thought to look. The offices of Hartwell and Crane occupied the 19th floor of a glass tower in downtown Cincinnati, and everything in the conference room was designed to make an ordinary person feel small. The table was a single slab of black walnut long enough to seat 14. The chairs were leather that sighed when you shifted. Rain moved in slow sheets down the floor-to-ceiling windows, and the gray light made the whole city look like it was underwater. Eleanor sat near the far end, in a wool coat she'd owned since the Clinton administration, her hands folded around a handbag with a clasp that no longer quite closed. She had taken 2 buses to get there. Her stepson had offered her a ride, then texted at the last minute that something had come up, and she understood the message underneath the message. You are not one of us, and today you will learn exactly what that means. Across the table sat that stepson, Bradford Voss, 54, Walter's son from his first marriage. Bradford wore a charcoal suit tailored close to a frame he kept expensive at a downtown gym, and he had the particular restlessness of a man who has spent his whole life waiting for money he did not earn. Beside him sat his wife, Camille, blonde and lacquered, and already glancing at her reflection in the dark window, and beside her, Walter's daughter Priscilla, who had flown in from Scottsdale for exactly this meeting and had made a point of mentioning her return flight was that same evening. They had loved Walter the way heirs love a bank, attentively, and only near the nights. When he was healthy, they visited twice a year. When he got sick, they visited less, because sickness was inconvenient, and Eleanor was there anyway, wasn't she? Let Eleanor handle it. Eleanor always handled it. At the head of the table sat the attorney, a lean, silver-haired man named Gerald Crane, senior partner, executor of the estate. He had known Walter for 30 years. He opened a leather folder, squared the pages inside it with 2 precise taps, and looked out over the table with the flat, unreadable expression of a man about to do something he had promised to do exactly as instructed. "Thank you all for being here," Crane said. Walter's instructions were unusually specific. "My job today is simply to carry them out to the letter, no more, no less." Bradford leaned back and let one ankle cross over his knee. "Let's just get to it, Gerald. We've all got flights and lives." Crane inclined his head and began to read. The numbers, when they came, were staggering, and they landed exactly where everyone in that room expected them to land. To Bradford. The house in Indian Hill, the brokerage account, and controlling shares in the manufacturing company. Walter had spent 40 years building, a package north of $9 million. Bradford nodded slowly, the way a man nods at something he considers overdue. To Priscilla, the vacation property on Lake Michigan, the art, and a trust valued at just over $4 million. Priscilla pressed a manicured hand to her chest and murmured something about how thoughtful Daddy always was. To Camille, because Walter had been fond of almost no one but was polite to the end, a bequest of jewelry and a modest cash gift. She smiled with only the bottom half of her face. And then Crane turned a page, and the room went quiet in a way that had teeth in it, because everyone knew whose name came next, and everyone had been waiting for it the way you wait for the punchline of a joke you've already been told. To my wife, Eleanor, Crane read, and his voice did not change at all. I leave the account described in the enclosed passbook and its full contents. He reached into the folder and slid a small object down the length of that enormous table. It came to rest in front of Eleanor with a sound no louder than a dry leaf landing. It was a bank passbook, the old kind, vinyl cover gone soft at the corners, the kind of thing banks stopped issuing decades ago. She opened it with hands that had learned not to shake in front of these people. Inside, stamped in faded ink on the final line, was a single balance. $1. 00. For one full second, nobody moved. And then Bradford laughed. It started as a snort and became something helpless and delighted, and Priscilla joined him, and Camille covered her mouth, but her shoulders gave her away. $1, Bradford managed. He left you $1. Oh, that's God. That's the most dad thing I've ever heard. 50 years and he had a sense of humor right up to the end. I suppose, Camille said sweetly. That's about what nursing pays these days. Don't spend it all in one place, Eleanor. The bus fare home is steep. Eleanor said nothing. She had learned a long time ago that the cruelest thing you can do to people who want to cease a break is to refuse to break where they can watch. She closed the passbook. She slid it into her handbag beside a folded tissue and a photograph of Walter at 30, laughing on a beach they'd never been able to afford to visit again. And she stood, and she gathered her coat, and she walked out of that room with her spine perfectly straight, while the laughter followed her down the hall. Like something with claws. She did not cry in the elevator. She did not cry in the lobby. She waited until she was outside under the awning, in the gray Cincinnati rain. And then she let herself cry the way you cry when it isn't about the money at all, when it's about 51 years, and a beach photograph, and the terrible arithmetic of a man reducing all of it to a single dollar in front of people who never earned the right to laugh. What she did not know, what none of them knew, was that Gerald Crane had watched her walk out with something flickering behind his flat expression that looked almost like satisfaction, because Crane knew what the dollar was. And he knew that the reading of the will was not the end of Walter's plan. It was the beginning. 4 days passed. Eleanor barely left the small apartment she and Walter had downsized into 3 years earlier. When the medical bills started their quiet erosion, the heat clicked on and off, unreliably. 2 notices sat unopened on the counter, and she already knew what they said, because she'd been getting versions of them for months. She wrapped herself in a quilt Walter's mother had made and sat by the window, and tried to understand a man she had loved for half a century, and apparently never fully known. You always knew the exact value of things, the note in the will had not said, but Walter had said something like it, once, years ago, in a tone she hadn't understood at the time. She'd assumed it was a compliment about her thrift. Now she wasn't sure. On the 4th day, there was a knock, sharp, deliberate, 3 raps. She rose stiffly and looked through the peephole, and her breath caught. Standing in the dim hallway of her building, a building where the carpet was worn to the backing, and the light in the stairwell had been out for a month, was Gerald Crane, in a suit that cost more than her rent, holding a slim leather briefcase. She opened the door on the chain. Mr. Crane, if Bradford sent you to make me sign something, I'd like to read it first this time. May I come in, Mrs. Voss? His voice was quieter than it had been in the conference room. I owe you an explanation, and I've been legally unable to give it to you until now. She let him in. He took in the apartment the way careful men take in a room. The unopened notices, the space heater, the single dollar sitting on the coffee table where she'd set it down and been unable to throw it away. He did not comment on any of it. He set his briefcase on the table and sat on the edge of the sofa, and for a moment the confident senior partner was gone. And what sat there instead was just a tired old man who had kept a promise for a very long time. "I need to apologize," Crane said, "for what happened in that room. It was cruel, and it was necessary. Walter designed it that way, down to the last detail, including which seat you'd be sitting in, and how long I would let them laugh before I stopped them, which was longer than I wanted to." He drew a slow breath. "There were witnesses in that room, Mrs. Voss. And there were cameras. Bradford's attorney insisted the reading be recorded, standard, in a contested estate. Walter knew there would be a recording. He counted on it." "Counted on it," Eleanor repeated. "Counted on them watching me get $1. Counted on them believing you got $1, Crane said. "There is a difference, and that difference is the whole design." He opened the briefcase. Inside was a thick sheaf of documents, banded and sealed, and stamped in more places than she could count. He set them on the table beside the single bill, and the weight of them made the flimsy table creak. "Mrs. Voss," he said, "the dollar in that passbook is not your inheritance. It never was. The dollar is a key." Eleanor sat down slowly across from him. "I don't understand." "Walter understood something about his children that it took him a long time to admit," Crane said. "He knew that if he left you anything of real value in that will, a house, an account, a number with commas in it, Bradford and Priscilla would contest it. They would tie the estate up in litigation for years. They would argue undue influence. They would argue you manipulated a sick man. They would bleed you dry with legal fees you cannot afford. And they would win by attrition, because they have money and time and you have neither." He paused. "You would die before you ever saw a penny. Walter knew that. So he made certain you would inherit something they would never bother to fight for. Something they would laugh at. Something so small and so humiliating that the moment they saw it, they would stop looking." Eleanor's eyes moved to the passbook. "The dollar. The account that passbook belongs to," Crane says, "is not a savings account. It's a sweep account, a linked control account. Walter opened it 11 years ago at Cincinnati Guaranty, the private bank. Its entire purpose is to serve as the named point of access to a safe deposit box. Not an ordinary box. A private vault in the oldest part of the bank that requires the passbook, the account number, and the biometric signature of the sole authorized party to open." He looked at her steadily. "You are the sole authorized party, Mrs. Voss. Walter added you 11 years ago. You signed a card you don't remember signing in a stack of insurance paperwork. On a Tuesday, over a cup of coffee. He told me you'd forget. He was counting on that too, so that if anyone ever asked you what you knew, your confusion would be genuine." The rain ticked against the window. Somewhere in the building a pipe knocked. "What's in the box?" Eleanor asked. Crane closed the briefcase. "It's better if I show you," he said. "The bank has a private viewing room. I've arranged for us to be there tomorrow morning before it opens. So there are no eyes. Bring the passbook. Bring nothing else." He stood and buttoned his jacket, and for just a moment he allowed himself a small, dry smile. "And Mrs. Voss, you may want to bring a larger handbag. Most people think an inheritance is a number, a pile of money that either exists or doesn't, sitting in an account with your name on it. But look closer at how the wealthy actually protect what they have, and you find something stranger and more deliberate. The rich don't leave money. They leave structures, trusts, holding companies, control accounts, keys. A dollar can be worth more than $1 million if the dollar is the thing that unlocks the vault and the million is just sitting inside, waiting." Walter Voss had spent the last decade of his life learning this the way a dying man learns anything, with total, unhurried attention. And he had built his final act around a single, humiliating, unforgeable idea. The people who chase the visible pile will never think to ask about the key. Cincinnati Guarantee Trust did not look like a bank. It looked like a private club, a limestone building from 1911 with a bronze door, and no signage larger than a business card, tucked on a side street. Most people walked past their whole lives without noticing. Crane met her at the door at 7 in the morning, before the staff arrived, and a silver-haired manager named Mr. O.C. let them in with the quiet deference of a man who had been told exactly who Eleanor was and exactly how to treat her. They took an elevator down. Not up, down, 2 levels below the street, into a part of the building that predated the elevator itself, where the walls were dressed stone and the air was cool and still, and smelled faintly of iron and old paper. At the end of a short corridor stood a vault door. Not steel modern, but heavy antique brass and hardened iron. The manufacturer's name engraved across it in serif letters worn smooth by a century of hands. Mr. O.C. asked for the passbook. Eleanor gave it to him. He read the account number aloud, entered it into a keypad that looked absurdly new against the old brass, and then turned to her. Mrs. Voss, the account requires the authorized party's thumbprint. Walter established the biometric enrollment 11 years ago at the same appointment you don't recall. He offered a small glass reader. If you would. She pressed her thumb to the glass. For one terrible second, nothing happened, and she thought, of course it's a mistake. Of course there's nothing. Of course they were right to laugh. Then the reader glowed green, and something deep inside the door, released with a sound like a held breath, finally let go. Mr. O.C. turned the wheel and pulled the door open and stepped back. I'll wait at the elevator, he said. Take whatever time you need. And he left them, because discretion at Cincinnati Guarantee was not a courtesy. It was the product. Eleanor stepped inside. The room beyond was not large, perhaps the size of her old kitchen, and it was lined floor to ceiling with steel drawers and shelving. And on those shelves, in the low warm light, was the thing Walter had built in secret over 11 years, while his children visited twice a year and his wife held his hand through the nights. Gold. Not coins scattered in a bag, but bars, small dense stamped ingots stacked in careful rows, each one bearing the seal of a Swiss refiner, each one catching the light with the particular heavy glow that no other metal has. Beside them, in a locked glass case, sat rolls of coins in protective sleeves, old American gold, the kind that had been illegal to hoard for 40 years, and had quietly become priceless. And on the lowest shelf in acid-free sleeves, thick as phone books, bearer bonds, stock certificates, deeds. And on a small table in the center of the room, alone, sat a wooden box and a letter sealed with a drop of red wax. Eleanor did not go to the gold. She went to the letter. Because after 51 years, the thing she wanted from Walter Voss was not money. It was the answer to the question she had been carrying since the moment that room full of people laughed at her. Did you know what you were doing to me? Did you understand what it cost? She broke the wax. The handwriting was his, though shakier than she remembered. The hand of a man writing near the end, refusing to stop until it was done. My Eleanor, it began. If you are reading this, then it worked. And they are counting a fortune that is already gone. And you are standing in the only room that ever mattered. I need you to know that the hardest thing I ever did was let them laugh at you. I sat with that cruelty for months before I chose it, and I chose it anyway, because I have watched Bradford and Priscilla my whole life, and I know exactly what they would have done to you if I had left you anything they could see. They would have called you a manipulator. They would have said you preyed on a dying man. They would have dragged your name and your 60 years of decency through a courtroom until there was nothing left, and they would have done it smiling. I could not protect you from them while I was alive. I was too weak, too tired, too far gone. So I protected you the only way left to me. I made you invisible. I made them look away. The dollar was not an insult, my love. The dollar was the only shield I had left to give you. You always knew the exact value of things. Now you know the value of that one. Everything in this room is yours, free and clear, held outside the estate in a structure they cannot touch and cannot even find. Live well, live loudly, and forgive me for the 4 days of grief I knew this would cost you. I would have spared you those days if sparing you them did not mean losing you everything. I saw you. For 51 years I saw you. I'm sorry I waited until now to say it where it could not be taken away. Yours always, Walter. Eleanor sat down on the cold stone floor of that vault, the letter pressed to her chest, and she wept. But it was a different weeping than the rain outside the lawyer's office 4 days before. That had been the weeping of a woman who thought she had given 51 years to a man who reduced her to a joke. This was the weeping of a woman who understood, finally, that she had been seen the whole time, that the humiliation had been an act of love so careful and so complete that it had to look like cruelty to work at all. Gerald Crane stood in the doorway and did not intrude. He had watched Walter build this room. He had promised to see it opened. And he had one more thing to tell her, when she was ready, about what Bradford and Priscilla had actually inherited, and why, within 6 months, they would come looking for her. Because here is the part Walter did not put in the letter, but had explained to Crane in detail across a dozen difficult afternoons. The $9 million Bradford inherited was real, but it was leveraged to the walls. In his last 2 years, quietly, Walter had borrowed heavily against the company and the house, and moved the borrowed value here, into hard assets, into this room. Bradford had not inherited a fortune. He had inherited a balance sheet. Assets on one side and on the other, debt that would come due like a tide. The house was mortgaged. The company carried loans its new owner didn't yet understand. Priscilla's trust was solvent, but modest against the lifestyle she'd built around, expecting more. They had inherited the appearance of wealth. Eleanor had inherited the thing itself. Within 6 months, Crane told her later, upstairs, over coffee in the manager's office, the loans will surface. Bradford will start selling to cover them and discover the assets are worth less than the debt against them. And somewhere in that process, a forensic accountant will find a trail, money that left the company and vanished into a structure they can't crack. They'll trace it as far as they can, and they will realize it ends with you. Eleanor wrapped her hands around the warm cup. She was quiet for a long moment, and when they come, she said, "What do I do?" Crane smiled, and it was the smile of a man who had been waiting 30 years to use a particular set of documents. "You do nothing," he said. "You let them come. And you let me be in the room." They came in 5 months, not 6. Bradford's world had unraveled faster than even Crane predicted. The mortgage on Indian Hill came due and could not be refinanced. The company's lenders called their loans. Camille's jewelry went to auction quietly, and then not quietly. Priscilla's Scottsdale life contracted like a lung, and through it all ran the maddening thread of the missing money. Millions that had clearly left Walter's holdings in his final years and simply disappeared. Bradford hired the forensic accountant. The forensic accountant found the edge of the structure. And the structure, when he chased it, ended at a name that made Bradford Voss physically ill: Eleanor. They confronted her in Crane's office. The same 19th floor, the same black walnut table, the same rain sheeting down the same windows, as if the city itself had a sense of symmetry. But everything else was different. Eleanor sat at the head of the table now, in a tailored gray suit, her hair done, a strand of pearls at her throat that she had chosen from the vault not because she needed to prove anything, but because she had spent 51 years earning the right to wear something beautiful. Bradford came in looking a decade older than he had at the will reading, his suit no longer quite fitting a body that stress had hollowed. Priscilla's tan had faded. Camille did not come at all. "You," Bradford said, and his voice cracked on the single word. "You had it, the whole time. You sat there and let us. You let us laugh at you, and you knew." "I didn't know," Eleanor said quietly. "Not then, that was the point. Your father made sure I couldn't give away a secret I didn't have." "You want to be angry at someone, Bradford." be angry at him. But he's gone, and he arranged all of this from the other side of that. And there is nothing you can do to him now. There is only what's left, and what's left is the truth. We'll contest it. Priscilla's voice was thin. Undue influence. You isolated him, you. Mrs. Voss inherited nothing from the estate, Crane said, and he did not raise his voice because he did not need to. He slid a folder to the center of the table. That is the entire elegance of it. The assets your father moved were transferred during his lifetime into a structure to which Mrs. Voss was added as the authorized party 11 years ago, long before any illness, long before any question of influence could possibly arise. There is nothing to contest. There is no will provision to overturn, because none of it passed through the will. Your father gave her $1 in his will, publicly, and you have the recording of yourselves laughing about it. He let that sit. I would advise against building a courtroom strategy around a video of yourselves, mocking an 81-year-old widow you now claim was the mastermind of a fraud. The room was very quiet. There's more, Crane said, and now his voice sharpened to the edge Eleanor had glimpsed once before. During the forensic review your own accountant conducted, Bradford, he documented certain irregularities in the company's books from the 2 years before your father's death, journal entries you authorized, adjustments you signed. Your father kept copies. He kept everything. He was, among other things, a very careful man. He tapped the folder. So here is where we are. Mrs. Voss has no interest in pursuing those irregularities. She has no interest in your bankruptcy, your creditors, or your reputation. She would like, in fact, to never see either of you again. But that mercy is a gift, not a right. And it is contingent on you standing up, walking out of this room, and never contesting, harassing, or contacting her again for the rest of your natural lives. Bradford stared at the folder. He did not open it. He didn't have to. His face had already opened it for him. And in that moment, Eleanor watched something happen that 51 years had taught her to recognize. The exact instant a bully understands he has finally met the one person he cannot outweight, outspend, or outcruel. He stood. He did not say anything. There was nothing left to say. Priscilla rose beside him, her hand shaking on the back of the chair, and the two of them walked out of the room the way Eleanor had walked out of it 5 months before. Except no one laughed, because there was no one left who found any of it funny. The door closed. The rain kept falling, and Eleanor Voss let out a long, slow breath she felt she had been holding. Since the morning a room full of people decided her whole life was worth $1. She did not keep it all. That was the thing that surprised even Crane. She kept the vault, and she kept enough to live the rest of her years without ever again lying awake over a heating bill or an unopened notice. She bought a small house with a garden, the kind of house she and Walter had talked about in the early years before the money got complicated and then got scarce. She planted rose bushes because she had always planted rose bushes in every place she had ever lived, and this was the first time in decades she owned the ground they grew in. And with the rest, with the gold and the bonds and the priceless coins that had once been illegal to hold, she built something. A fund, in Walter's name, for family caregivers, the wives and husbands and daughters and sons who give up their careers and their savings and their sleep to care for someone dying, and who so often end up with nothing but the dignity of having stayed. Cash grants, respite care, legal help for the ones whose loyalty gets weaponized against them in probate courts by relatives who visited twice a year. She named it after Walter, but everyone who worked there understood, without being told, that it was really named after her. On the first anniversary of the will reading, Eleanor sat in her garden as the light went gold and low over the roses. She took out the passbook. She had never returned it, and Cincinnati Guarantee had never asked. She opened it to the last line, to the single faded stamp Aller Zeron. She ran her thumb over it the way you touch the face of someone you loved and lost, and she smiled, and she said it out loud, to Walter, to the roses, to the fading light. The thing he had told her once, years ago, in a tone she finally understood. "You always did know the exact value of things," she said. "So did I. It just took me a while to see the price tag on the one thing that mattered." They had laughed at her $1. They had counted their millions and flown home to their comfortable lives. Certain they had won, certain the loyal old woman in the wool coat had been put in her place at last. And she had let them laugh, because Walter had taught her the last and best lesson of a long marriage. That the people who are busy counting what they can see will never once think to ask about the key. And the key, worn soft at the corners, stamped with a single humiliating dollar, sitting forgotten in a handbag that wouldn't quite close, had been in her hands the entire time. She closed the passbook. She looked out at her roses, and for the first time in a very long time, Eleanor Voss was not the one who had shown up and been forgotten. She was the one who had known, all along, exactly what she was worth. If Eleanor's journey from a humiliating $1 inheritance to quiet, complete vindication moved you, take a moment to hit that like button and share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss another tale of loyalty repaid and karma delivered. And tell me in the comments, if you found a single dollar that turned out to be the key to everything, what's the first thing you would have done? I'll be reading every one.